about being an airman and how they look at the future and whether or not they want to decide to stay airmen. And those are things that we have to actually be attentive to. Our equipment is also showing signs of wear and tear. You know, we all know we've exceeded the miles on our vehicles, the hours on our aircraft, and the readiness challenges have been exacerbated by delays in some of the major programs that we have, the F-35, the nuclear enterprise, certainly one familiar to airmen. So I understand that we can't be complacent about today's competitive advantage. We have to restore our readiness, and that means recruiting and retaining the right number of high-quality people, modernizing the force, delivering quality training, and catching up on the maintenance of some of our infrastructure that has been neglected for many years. Doing all that's going to require making hard choices. It's going to require that we adapt the force that we have today to meet today's requirements, but probably as importantly, and maybe more importantly, it's going to require that we innovate, we identify disruptive ways to do things in the future. In the end, we have to develop and maintain what I describe as comprehensive joint readiness. And for me, this is actually the deliverable for all of us in the joint force. We've got to deliver viable military options to the National Command Authority during a crisis or a contingency. And we've got to maintain the flexibility to be able to transition from one crisis or contingency to another across the range of military operations. And again, we have to ensure that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines don't ever find themselves in a fair fight. That's our collective responsibility, and with your help, that's actually what I'll focus on for the rest of my tenure as the chairman. I think most people here have heard the oft-used quote now by Henry Kissinger that today we find ourselves in the most volatile and complex security environment since World War II. And after it's just about 12 months as the chairman, you're not going to get an argument from me about Henry Kissinger's quote. I certainly have seen that. You know, although the institutions and the structures that have underpinned the international order for the last several decades remain largely intact, the United States is now confronted by simultaneous challenges in Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremism. And most of you have heard these referred to collectively as the 4+1. And we use that 4+1 as a tool when we plan, when we assess risk, and when we make program recommendations. And that's not to suggest that I think that the 4+1 is predictive. If I have learned anything in my time in uniform, it's the need to be humble about our ability to predict the future. But I have found that looking at the four challenges, really more properly looking at those four challenges as a lens through which to look at the joint force is useful. And it can actually answer one of the questions we always ask, which is ready for what? Ready for what? I think looking through that lens will help us answer that question. It can also inform our assessment of the joint capabilities and capacities that we have in the inventory today, the joint inventory today, and the inventory that we will require in the future. So for me, I find 4+1 to be a useful benchmark. And my assumption, and this is important, and if during the question and answer period you don't actually believe this assumption, you have to challenge me on it. My assumption is that if we take a look at those 4+1 and we build joint capabilities and capacities that can deal with the challenges associated with those 4+1 or some combination thereof, in the future we will find ourselves with a competitive advantage against any adversary. So as we start to look at trends in capability development in those 4+1, we look at the current capabilities they have, we look at their organizational structure, and we look at the scenarios under which we might find ourselves confronting those 4+1, I think we'll be close to getting it right, even with a recognition that where we fight in the future may not have anything to do with those 4+1, if passed as prologue. Let me start a little bit with Russia. The Russian military, from my perspective, does present the greatest array of threats to our interests. And despite their demographic and economic challenges, they've made significant investments in their military capabilities. They're also operating with a frequency and in areas that we really haven't seen for over 2 decades. And over the past few years, we've seen Russia modernize existing systems that pose a direct threat to the United States and our allies. These include long-range conventional strike and nuclear capabilities. Russia is also focused on developing robust cyber, space, electronic warfare, and undersea capabilities. In my judgment, their operational capability and their capability development, coupled with innovative doctrinal and strategic approaches, are designed to do something that's pretty clear to me. They're designed to undermine the alliance, the NATO alliance, and they're designed to undermine the ability of the United States and NATO to project power. In the Pacific, our policy is to seek ways to cooperate with China. But from a military perspective, we're watching the militarization of the South China Sea and the expanding presence of China outside of Asia. And while China's intentions and budget are traditionally opaque, very difficult to see exactly where they're headed, it's pretty clear to me that Chinese leadership is embarked on a significant program to modernize the nuclear enterprise, as well as their power projection, space, cyber, ballistic missile, and air defense capabilities. Similar to Russia, China seeks to limit our ability to project power and to undermine the credibility of our alliances in the Pacific. And just as an aside, when the chiefs and I went through kind of the process of discovery over the past year to develop the national military strategy that I'll speak about later, we talked about centers of gravity. And I think now from our collective perspective, our center of gravity as a nation really is our alliance and partner structure that's been built up over the last 70 years at the strategic level. And at the operational level, it's our ability to project power. So those two things, in my judgment, are those that we draw our strength from. Our alliance and partner structure and our ability to project power. And again, I've just talked about China and Russia, and from my perspective, what they're focused, they recognize that as well as we recognize that fact, and they're focused exactly on that as they conduct capability development in their operational activity. North Korea's unpredictable behavior and capability development also continues to threaten allies and potentially the homeland, and many of you in this room know that well. And we've all seen the recent efforts to develop cyber capabilities, ballistic missile capabilities, and developments in a nuclear program. It's consumed an awful lot of time, I think, fair to say, of senior leadership's time over the past few weeks. The Iranian regime aims to establish itself as the dominant regional power in the Middle East. And when I talk about Iran, I say, hey, their major export is actually malign influence. And they're doing that as they modernize, a broad array of maritime, ballistic missile, space, cyber, and cruise missile capabilities. And finally, we continue to grapple with the challenge of trans-regional violent extremism, and that includes ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and all the associated movements. And, of course, our primary effort in the recent months has been against core ISIL in Iraq and Syria. Let me just take just a minute to maybe provide a perspective on the current fight against core ISIL. And I suspect many of you are familiar with the 9 lines of operation that constitute our national strategy, and they cover areas from governance, intelligence, finance, messaging, and foreign fighters. So the full range of issues that would have to be addressed. Well, there's a military dimension to all 9 lines of effort in our national strategy. There's 2 specific areas that we have the lead on. The first is strikes to kill ISIL leadership and fighters, degrade their military capabilities, interdict their lines of communication, and get after their resources. And the second is to develop effective partners on the ground and support their ability to secure ISIL-held terrain. Conceptually, the campaign is designed to put simultaneous pressure on ISIL across Iraq and Syria. And of course, Syria presents for us the most difficult challenge. Success in Syria is going to require us to work with our Turkish partners to secure the Syrian-Turkish border. It's going to require us to work with vetted Syrian opposition forces who are willing to fight ISIL. And we're also, at the same time, striking core ISIL's command and control, their sources of revenue, disrupting, and this is important because it's our #1 priority, disrupting their ability to plan and conduct attacks against the homeland, which is our number one focus. With coalition support and our partners on the ground, the Syrian Democratic Forces, we've been successful in taking back a large amount of territory from ISIL over the past year. And in recent months alone, the SDF's operations in Shadadi and most recently in Manbij have really cut the line of communications between Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq, and also, as importantly, eliminated one of the critical nodes for foreign fighters and the flow of resources into and out of Syria, again related to that external threat, which is our primary focus. Over time, the size of the Syrian Democratic Forces and the number of Arabs in those forces have grown. And for those who don't watch it very closely, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely a Kurdish force of about 30,000, and we have about 14,000 Arabs now that are associated with that force. To put that in some perspective, last year at this time, we probably had a few hundred vetted Syrian opposition forces on the ground that we were supporting. So there's been a significant growth, 30,000 Arabs, 14,000 Arabs associated with them, and then 2,000 more vetted Syrian opposition that are actually working with us and the Turks along the Turkish-Syrian border. So the size of the force has grown, and we're going to try to grow it even more, even as we balance Turkish concerns about our support for the Syrian Democratic Forces. With respect to Russian activity in Syria, there's absolutely no doubt that it has complicated things, and Russia has put itself in a position to actually influence the eventual political solution. And needless to say, recent events have complicated the situation with regard to Russia, and I suspect many in this room, the Chief included, will be working hard on that over the next few days. To say that, you know, I had a group of chiefs of defense in Berlin on Monday to talk about the counter-ISIL campaign, and I said, you know, if we were tasked to lock ourselves in a room all day and develop a complicated scenario, a complicated political military scenario, I don't think we would have had the imagination to come up with the Syria scenario and the complications that we're dealing with as we deal with ISIL in Syria. But on balance, I would say the pressure we put on ISIL in Syria has degraded their capabilities, it's reduced their territory they hold, it's limited their freedom of movement and reduced their resources. And probably, most importantly, I believe we have started to chip away at the narrative of inevitable success, the narrative of a caliphate. Much more work to be done. A focus now in Syria is operations in Raqqa, which is decisive terrain for the physical caliphate and really the one remaining critical node for external operations inside of Syria. In Iraq, the situation, as you well know, is complicated by the political landscape, sectarianism, and Iranian influence. And success there is going to require that we continue to develop Iraqi and Kurdish security forces and enable their operations with intelligence, advisors, logistics, and combined arms support. Well, mindful of the complex challenges that we face in Iraq, I'm encouraged by the growth of Iraqi security forces, the growth of the Peshmerga, and their success in places over the last year, in places like Ramadi, in Fallujah, in the western Anbar province, and more recently in the area that surrounds Mosul. They've actually gained a significant amount of momentum. And to me, those operations actually are indicative of what's in the art of the possible. Moving forward, and I think you've seen this in the media, and some of you are either just returning from a deployment, perhaps, or going on deployment, we're focused on Mosul. And just as an aside, we assess today that the Iraqis will have, in early October, all the forces marshaled, trained, fielded, equipped that are necessary for operations in Mosul. And the timing of that operation now is really just a function of a political decision by Prime Minister Abadi. And we will be in a position to provide whatever support, whatever reinforcement those forces need in order to be successful. And again, I guess I'd wrap it up by saying I think it's indisputable that over the past year we have gained momentum, we have taken back significant territory, we have limited the enemy's freedom of movement, we have been able to get after some of the leadership, and we have chipped away at their resources. You know, there's many reasons why I can tell you that we've had success over the past year, but it's worth noting, and I say this not to pander to the crowd, but it's worth noting that the critical enabler of the counter-ISIL strategy has been air power. Since 2014, airmen have provided air interdiction, ISR, close air support, humanitarian assistance, and global reach to the campaign. It's been air power that has had the most devastating effect on the leadership, resources, and freedom of movement of ISIL. And it's also been the most important factor in supporting our partners on the ground. But victory in Raqqa and Mosul won't be the end. Figuratively speaking, it's the day after Mosul and the day after Raqqa that actually makes the difference. And of course, that's figuratively speaking for we're not going to be successful in defeating ISIL in either location unless the basic issues of governance are addressed. That will be how ISIL is defeated in the end in Iraq and Syria. But we will have done our part for the military to set the conditions where that can take place. And of course, we still have to deal with ISIL and other trans-regional threats from Southeast Asia to West Africa. And as you know, again, many of you involved in that, we do have forces deployed in West Africa. We're currently supporting operations in Libya. We have forces deployed conducting counter-violent extremist operations in East Africa, as well as Afghanistan. And we're doing a significant amount of partnership capacity building